Imagine, if you will, the medieval executioner. What springs to mind? Probably a hulking figure cloaked in black, a menacing hood obscuring his face, standing by a grim scaffold under a perpetually cloudy sky, a glinting axe poised for its gruesome descent. He's a creature of shadow and dread, a symbol of ultimate justice or perhaps ultimate cruelty. He certainly isn't someone you'd imagine bumping into at the local bakery, haggling over the price of a loaf or complaining about the cost of roof repairs. And yet, for many a medieval executioner, that latter image, the one of mundane, everyday life, was far closer to the truth than the dramatic, Hollywood-esque caricature we've painted. The reality was, for the most part, shockingly ordinary. Forget the mysterious, almost supernatural aura. The medieval executioner was, at his core, a professional. Yes, a professional in the business of death and pain, but a professional nonetheless. He wasn't some rogue sadist who just showed up when the mood struck him or a volunteer with a particularly strong stomach. No, sir, this was a job, often a salaried position, complete with a contract, a fixed income, and sometimes even perks. Think of it less as a dark art and more like, say, being the town's designated pest control specialist, but for humans who had really stepped out of line. He had a roster of duties, a set of tools, and a very specific skill set, much like a carpenter or a blacksmith. Just, with a slightly more permanent impact on his clientele. In many towns, the executioner was a paid employee of the local lord, the city council, or the reigning monarch. He might receive a regular salary, a steady stream of coins that allowed him to put food on the table, pay his rent, and perhaps even afford a decent pair of boots. Or he might operate on a fee-for-service basis, earning a set amount for each execution, each session of torture, or each branding. It was a bit like a medieval Uber driver, but instead of taking you to your destination, he was taking you to your final one, and the ride was decidedly less comfortable. This financial stability, however grim its source, meant that the executioner wasn't necessarily impoverished. He was a working man earning his keep just like anyone else. He had bills to pay, mouths to feed, and probably a nagging spouse wondering why he couldn't just get a nice, clean job like a miller. This professional status, however, came with a rather unique social paradox. While the executioner was an essential cog in the machinery of law and order, a vital part of the justice system, he was also deeply, profoundly ostracized. It was a bit like being the town's most important person whom absolutely no one wanted to invite to dinner. He was needed, indispensable even, for maintaining public peace and demonstrating the Lord's power. Without him, the threat of punishment would lose its sharpest edge. But his very profession, steeped in blood and suffering, rendered him ritually unclean in the eyes of many. People might cross the street to avoid him, whisper behind his back, or refuse to share a drink with him at the tavern. His children might find it hard to marry outside the executioner's family, a sort of hereditary occupational curse. It was a lonely existence, often confined to the edges of society, literally living on the outskirts of town, in a house that perhaps even the rats gave a wide berth to. He was the necessary evil, a human broom sweeping away society's unwanted dust, but no one wanted that broom to touch them. And speaking of dust, or rather dirt, the executioner's job was rarely just about the dramatic final act. That axe-wielding moment was just the grand finale of a much longer, grittier show. Before the curtain fell, there were often many rehearsals. His duties frequently included administering torture, a far more drawn-out and intimate affair than a swift beheading. Imagine the paperwork, or rather the lack thereof, that would precede such an event. No tidy forms to fill out, just a magistrate's order and the grim reality of the task at hand. He was the one responsible for extracting confessions, or at least what passed for confessions under duress. This involved a variety of unpleasant contraptions: the rack, the thumbscrews, the strappado, the boot, and many more delightful inventions designed to inflict maximum pain with minimum fuss. He had to know how to apply just enough pressure to achieve the desired result without actually killing the subject too soon, which would defeat the purpose of the confession. It was a delicate balance, a macabre dance between agony and information, and the executioner was the choreographer. He needed a strong arm, an even stronger stomach, and perhaps a truly impressive ability to compartmentalize. Beyond the theater of torture and the final curtain of execution, the executioner's portfolio expanded into other forms of corporal punishment. Branding, for instance, was a common task. Imagine the smell of burning flesh, the sizzle, the screams, all part of a Tuesday afternoon for our man. He'd heat the iron, press it firmly against the skin, leaving a permanent mark of shame, a scarlet letter for all to see. This wasn't a job for the squeamish, nor for someone who liked their work neat and tidy. It was messy, visceral, and required a steady hand, even if the recipient was thrashing. Then there were the various forms of mutilation, cropping ears for petty theft, cutting off hands for more serious larceny, or even gouging out eyes. These were not just symbolic acts, they were physical disfigurements intended to mark the criminal for life, a living, breathing warning to others. The executioner was the instrument of this permanent alteration, a human sculptor of shame. But perhaps the most truly mundane and often overlooked aspect of the medieval executioner's life involved tasks that had nothing whatsoever to do with human justice. Remember that social ostracism? It meant that many jobs considered unclean or degrading by the general populace fell to him. One of the most common was the disposal of animal carcasses. When a cow dropped dead in the field or a pig succumbed to disease, who did you call? Not the local butcher who wanted no part of that putrid mess. You called the executioner. He was the designated remover of dead animals, dragging them away, often to be skinned for their hides, a process he also performed. He was the medieval equivalent of a rendering plant, but a one-man operation, often working in solitude, surrounded by flies and the stench of decay. This wasn't just a side gig, it was often a significant portion of his income and a constant reminder of his low social standing. He was the man who dealt with the literal dirt of the world, both human and animal. He might also be involved in tanning hides, a notoriously smelly and unpleasant trade, or even acting as a rudimentary sanitation worker, clearing refuse from the streets. Imagine the irony. The man who dealt with the most extreme forms of human depravity was also the one cleaning up the town's literal garbage. It speaks volumes about the medieval mindset, where the physical act of handling filth, whether human or animal, was seen as equally defiling as the act of inflicting pain and death. His life was a constant dance with the unsavory, a daily immersion in the less palatable aspects of existence. Far from being a figure of dark romance, the medieval executioner was often a grimy, overworked, and socially isolated individual. His days filled with a peculiar blend of official violence and the very unglamorous tasks that no one else wanted to touch. He was, in essence, the ultimate utilitarian, performing the dirty work that kept the wheels of medieval society, however creakily, turning. And what a set of tools he had, each one a silent, gleaming testament to his grim profession. Forget the romanticized image of a single mighty axe. The medieval executioner's workshop, if you could call it that, was more akin to a specialized hardware store for the terminally unlucky. His primary implements were often the axe and the sword, each chosen for specific circumstances and sometimes for the social standing of the condemned. The axe was the workhorse, the blunt instrument of common justice. It was heavy, designed for power more than finesse, and required a strong back and an even stronger resolve to wield effectively. Imagine trying to split firewood, but the wood is screaming. This wasn't a delicate surgical instrument, it was a tool of brute force meant to sever life with a single decisive blow, or at least that was the intention. The sword, on the other hand, was often reserved for those of higher birth. A noble, even in disgrace, was sometimes granted the dignity of a sword execution, a quicker, cleaner death that bespoke a certain respect for their former status. This wasn't just any sword, it was a specially weighted, broad-bladed weapon designed for decapitation. Wielding it required immense skill and precision, a ballet of death where a slight miscalculation could turn a swift end into a prolonged horror. It was the difference between a sledgehammer and a scalpel, though both were equally lethal. The executioner had to be a master of both, adapting his technique to the tool and the unfortunate soul before him. Then there were the ropes, simple, sturdy lengths of hemp, yet imbued with a terrifying finality. For hanging, for strangling, for binding the condemned to the various instruments of torture. These weren't just for show, they were integral to the process, from leading the prisoner to the scaffold to the final, suffocating act. And let's not forget the smaller, yet equally chilling, tools. The branding irons, often shaped into letters or symbols representing the crime, heated to a cherry red in a small brazier. The pincers for various forms of mutilation, the knives for dismemberment, the weights for the rack. Each had its place, each its purpose in the grim repertoire of medieval punishment. Maintaining these instruments was a critical part of the executioner's routine. An axe had to be razor-sharp, its edge honed to a terrifying keenness. A dull blade meant a messy, agonizing death, and that was bad for business, and even worse for the executioner's reputation. Imagine the public outcry if he had to hack at someone multiple times, like a clumsy butcher. He'd spend hours grinding and polishing, ensuring that his tools were always ready for their next inevitable task. The swords, too, needed meticulous care, kept free of rust and nicks, their balance perfect. These weren't just pieces of metal, they were extensions of his grim purpose, and their condition directly reflected his professionalism. It was a macabre form of craftsmanship, where the quality of his work was measured in the swiftness of a life extinguished. But even with the sharpest tools and the steadiest hand, the job was fraught with peril, both physical and psychological. The most immediate and terrifying occupational hazard was the botched execution. This was the executioner's ultimate nightmare, a professional failure of the most public and gruesome kind. Imagine the scene, a crowd gathered, baying for justice or perhaps just for entertainment. The condemned is on the block, the axe is raised, and then it goes wrong. A glancing blow, a missed mark, a struggle from the victim. Instead of a clean severance, there's a gurgling, a thrashing, a prolonged agony. The crowd, which moments before was a passive observer, could turn into a furious mob in an instant. Their bloodlust, unfulfilled by a quick death, might turn on the executioner himself. He could face a hail of stones, curses, or even physical assault. His life, already precarious, would become truly dangerous. The shame, the professional discredit, the very real threat of violence, these were the immediate consequences of a moment's error. It was a job where perfection was demanded, and the cost of imperfection was paid in pain, both for the condemned and for the man wielding the blade. Beyond the immediate danger of an enraged crowd, there was the constant, insidious psychological toll. Imagine living with the weight of so many deaths on your conscience, or perhaps the chilling absence of conscience required to perform such acts day in and day out. The constant exposure to suffering, the screams, the pleas, the sight of blood and severed limbs, these were not things a normal mind could process without consequence. Some executioners might have become utterly hardened, their emotions calcified into a thick, impenetrable shell. Others might have sought solace in drink, drowning the horrors of the day in cheap ale. Nightmares must have been a constant companion, the faces of the condemned haunting their sleep, the echoes of their final breaths lingering in the quiet moments. It required an almost superhuman ability to compartmentalize, to separate the man from the monster, the professional from the human being who had to return to his lonely house at the edge of town. It was a job that didn't just take lives, it took pieces of the executioner's soul, chipping away at his humanity with each swing of the axe. Physical dangers extended beyond the crowd's wrath. A condemned person, even bound, might struggle violently, leading to an accidental injury to the executioner. A slip of the foot, a sudden lurch, and a sharp blade could find its way into the wrong flesh. And then there was the ever-present threat of disease. Handling corpses, especially those of individuals who might have died from various ailments, exposed the executioner to contagions that were poorly understood in the medieval era. He was often dealing with the sick and the dying before they even reached their final moments, and then their lifeless bodies afterward. It was a biological lottery, where every interaction could be a roll of the dice with his own health. And finally, the social ostracism, which we touched upon earlier, wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a hazard to his very existence. The loneliness, the inability to form normal social bonds, the constant suspicion and fear from others, this was a form of psychological torture in itself. His house, often isolated, became a symbol of his pariah status. His children, if he had any, would inherit this burden, struggling to find acceptance, their lineage forever tainted by their father's profession. It was a life lived in the shadows, not just metaphorically, but often literally, as he was relegated to the fringes of the community. He was the necessary outsider, the one who performed the acts that society demanded but could not stomach, forever marked by the grim nature of his calling. His existence was a stark reminder that some jobs, however essential, come with a price far greater than any salary could ever truly compensate for. His existence was a stark reminder that some jobs, however essential, come with a price far greater than any salary could ever truly compensate for. But even a man whose main gig involved taking lives had bills to pay and a family to feed, even if said family was often just as isolated as he was. So, like any good entrepreneur looking to diversify his portfolio, the medieval executioner often picked up a few extra side hustles. And let's be honest, these weren't the kind of side hustles that got you featured in the local town newsletter, unless that newsletter was dedicated entirely to the grimmest, smelliest, and most socially unsavory occupations imaginable. One of the most common and frankly most fitting of these auxiliary duties was that of the skinner of dead animals. Picture this: a cow drops dead in a farmer's field, its belly distended, flies buzzing around like tiny evil drones. Or a hog succumbs to some medieval swine flu, its carcass bloating in the village sty. Who you gonna call? Not the local butcher, not the town crier, and certainly not the village priest. No, you sent for the executioner. His hands, accustomed to the intimate handling of human anatomy, were deemed perfectly suited for the equally unglamorous task of stripping hide from carcass. It was a job nobody else wanted, largely because it was filthy, backbreaking, and steeped in the stench of decay. But for the executioner, who was already dealing with the human equivalent of unpleasantness, a dead cow was just another Tuesday. He'd haul the heavy beast away, often dragging it through the narrow streets, probably leaving a delightful trail of fluids and flies in his wake before getting down to the business of skinning it. The hide was valuable, a commodity that could be sold, and the meat, well, that was often just left to scavengers or buried, depending on the cause of death and how quickly he got there. It was a truly rank business, a symphony of putrefaction, but it added a few extra shillings to his coin purse. Closely related to the skinning business was the equally delightful trade of tanning. After all, what's a good hide without being properly processed into leather? Tanning, however, was a job that made skinning look like a stroll through a rose garden. This was a process that involved soaking animal skins in vats of all sorts of delightful concoctions, including urine, animal dung, and various chemical solutions, sometimes for months on end. The smell from a medieval tannery was legendary, capable of peeling paint off walls and curdling milk from miles away. It was a stench so profound it could probably resurrect the dead, just to make them wish they were dead again. Tanners were often relegated to the very outskirts of town, usually downwind, and for good reason. And guess who often found themselves elbow-deep in these noxious vats? Our friend the executioner. His existing social pariah status meant he had little to lose by taking on yet another job that no one else in their right mind would touch. It required a certain robust disregard for olfactory pleasure and a willingness to embrace truly awful working conditions, a skill he had in spades from his main profession. Then there was the rather poetic, if grimly ironic, side hustle of being a sanitation worker. Medieval towns, for all their charming half-timbered houses and bustling marketplaces, were, to put it mildly, cesspits. Waste management was not exactly a high-tech endeavor. People would simply toss their garbage, their slop, and their human waste right out their windows into the street below. Rain might wash some of it away, but most of it just festered. The executioner, or sometimes a designated night soil man who was often the executioner himself or someone of similar low social standing, was responsible for periodically clearing this truly spectacular mess. Imagine shoveling piles of decomposing refuse, human excrement, and general detritus, often under the cloak of darkness to avoid offending delicate sensibilities. He was the medieval equivalent of a very specialized, very smelly, and completely unappreciated garbage. His job was to literally clean up the mess of society, a stark metaphor for his overall role. The flies, the rats, the unimaginable stench, it was all part of the job description, a testament to his willingness to do what others couldn't or wouldn't. But perhaps the most truly fascinating and deeply paradoxical of the executioner's side gigs involved the realm of medicine and folk remedies. This is where things get really interesting and a little bit spooky. Due to his primary profession, the executioner possessed an intimate, hands-on knowledge of human anatomy, far beyond what most medieval physicians or barber surgeons would acquire. He saw bodies dissected, limbs removed, and bones exposed. He understood how the human machine worked, often better than those who merely theorized from old texts. This practical, albeit gruesome, education sometimes led him to act as a bone setter or a crude surgeon. If you broke an arm or dislocated a shoulder and couldn't afford a learned physician, the local executioner might just be your best, most affordable bet. He had a knack for it, derived from countless hours handling human remains. It was a strange juxtaposition. The man who broke bodies also knew how to put them back together. Even more bizarre was his involvement in folk medicine and superstitions. In a world rife with belief in magic and the power of morbid relics, the executioner was often seen as someone who could traffic in powerful, albeit dark, cures. It was believed that the body parts of executed criminals held special magical properties. A piece of rope from the gallows, a chip of the execution block, or even a sliver of bone from a condemned man could be sold as talismans for luck, fertility, or protection from illness. The blood of an executed person, especially from a pure criminal like a murderer, was thought to cure epilepsy, a belief that sometimes led sufferers to rush forward after an execution to drink the fresh blood. The executioner, being the man in charge of the body, became the supplier for these gruesome remedies. He might discreetly sell bits of hair, teeth, or even strips of skin, becoming a purveyor of hangman's cures to a superstitious populace desperate for any relief from suffering. It was a truly morbid market, but one that further supplemented his income, turning the instruments and byproducts of his dreadful work into a macabre source of profit. The irony, of course, was that the very man who inflicted such suffering was also, in a strange and twisted way, seen as a source of healing and good fortune, a walking, breathing paradox in the heart of the medieval world. The irony, of course, was that the very man who inflicted such suffering was also, in a strange and twisted way, seen as a source of healing and good fortune, a walking, breathing paradox in the heart of the medieval world. But while the executioner's unique skill set was undeniably tied to the ultimate irrevocable punishment, his presence and the sheer variety of his grim duties served as a constant reminder that medieval justice wasn't always about the axe or the rope. Oh no, the spectrum of medieval crime and punishment was a vast, colorful tapestry, woven with threads of petty grievances, grand conspiracies, and an astonishing array of inventive ways to make people regret their life choices. Think of it this way: capital punishment was the grand finale, the fireworks display at the end of a very long, very uncomfortable show. But most acts of misconduct, from a quarrel over a boundary stone to a minor theft, didn't warrant such a dramatic exit. For the vast majority of lawbreakers, medieval justice opted for a more drawn-out, often public, but decidedly less fatal form of reckoning. This meant a dizzying array of punishments that were designed to humiliate, to inconvenience, to inflict pain, or to financially drain, often with a flair for the dramatic that would make a modern reality TV producer blush. Let's start with the lighter end of the spectrum, though lighter in medieval terms often still meant a healthy dose of public shame. Fines were common, a straightforward way to make the offender pay for their transgressions, literally. Steal a pig, pay a fine, brawling in the marketplace, that'll cost you. These fines could be substantial, enough to cripple a peasant family for months, perhaps even years. It was a good old-fashioned medieval tax on misbehavior, and it filled the coffers of the local lord or town council, turning lawbreaking into a surprising source of income. It was, in essence, an early form of speed camera, except instead of detecting your car, it was detecting your questionable moral compass. But if fines didn't quite fit the bill, or if the offense was deemed more serious, or if the offender simply couldn't cough up the cash, then the justice system often turned to public humiliation. Enter the stocks and the pillories. These weren't just picturesque relics in a village square, they were active, functioning instruments of public shaming. The stocks immobilized the feet, often for hours or even days, leaving the culprit vulnerable to the jeers, insults, and occasional rotten vegetable projectile from the gathered crowd. It was like being trapped in a particularly unpleasant, very public timeout. The pillory, on the other hand, held the head in hands, forcing the offender to stand upright, often on a raised platform, making them an even more prominent target for public ridicule. Imagine being forced to stand there, unable to defend yourself, while everyone you know and everyone you don't walked by, pointed, and perhaps offered some unsolicited fashion advice in the form of a flung egg. These weren't just about physical discomfort. They were about social degradation, about stripping away dignity in plain sight. For those who truly pushed the boundaries, or whose crimes were considered particularly offensive to the moral fabric of society, physical pain entered the equation. Whipping, for instance, was a common punishment for various offenses, from petty theft to vagrancy. It was administered publicly, of course, ensuring that the sting of the lash was accompanied by the sting of public scrutiny. The number of lashes would vary depending on the severity of the crime and sometimes the whim of the magistrate. It was a visceral reminder that justice, in medieval times, was often felt directly on the skin. And then there was branding. While we've touched upon the executioner's role in this, it's worth noting the ubiquity of this punishment. A thief might be branded on the hand or cheek with a T for thief, a runaway serf with an R for rogue, or a blasphemer with a cross on their forehead. This wasn't just about pain, it was about creating a permanent, visible scarlet letter marking the individual for life. Everywhere they went, their crime was literally etched into their flesh. It was a walking, talking billboard of their past misdeeds, a constant barrier to anonymity and a stark deterrent to others contemplating similar acts. Imagine trying to get a decent job or even a sympathetic glance with a giant's "for scoundrel" seared onto your forehead. Not exactly conducive to a fresh start. For crimes considered truly heinous, but still short of a capital offense, the medieval imagination conjured up mutilation. This was where the line between punishment and permanent disfigurement blurred. A hand might be cut off for repeated theft, an ear cropped for perjury or minor assault, or a nose split for various other offenses. These were not light sentences. These were life-altering, visible penalties that irrevocably changed the individual's physical form. They were meant to be a constant, living reminder of their crime, not just for the individual, but for everyone who saw them. It was justice literally carving itself onto the human body. The logic was grimly practical. If you used your hand to steal, you lost your hand. If your tongue spoke falsely, your tongue might be pierced or even cut out. It was an eye for an eye philosophy, often taken quite literally with a medieval twist. The decision of which punishment to apply was a complex affair, often depending on a fascinating blend of factors. The severity of the crime was naturally paramount. Grand theft was treated more harshly than petty larceny, but then came the nuances. The social status of the offender played a surprisingly significant role. A noble might face a fine or a period of exile for an offense that would see a commoner whipped or branded. There was a clear class divide in the justice system, much like an exclusive club where some members got to break the rules with less severe repercussions. It was a polite fiction that everyone was equal before the law, a fiction often shattered by the reality of social hierarchy. Finally, local customs and traditions held immense sway. What was punished harshly in one town might be a mere slap on the wrist in another. One village might favor the stocks for minor offenses, while its neighbor preferred public whipping. Laws weren't uniformly applied across an entire kingdom. They were often dictated by the whims of the local lord, the ancient charters of a town, or the accumulated precedents of generations. This patchwork of justice meant that crossing an invisible boundary could change your fate dramatically. It was like driving between states today, where a traffic violation could go from a minor ticket to a major headache just by crossing a line on the map. Except in the Middle Ages, the ticket might be the loss of an ear. The medieval justice system, with its bewildering array of punishments, was a stark reflection of a society grappling with order, morality, and the ever-present challenge of keeping its unruly population in line. One public humiliation, one financial burden, or one permanent mark at a time. The medieval justice system, with its bewildering array of punishments, was a stark reflection of a society grappling with order, morality, and the ever-present challenge of keeping its unruly population in line. One public humiliation, one financial burden, or one permanent mark at a time. But while the various forms of fines, floggings, and mutilations served their purpose, there was one particular spectacle that truly brought the town together, albeit in a morbid, often gleeful fashion: the public execution. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was an event, a performance, a morbid carnival that drew crowds like flies to honey, a stark and dramatic reminder of the ultimate power of the ruling authority. Imagine the atmosphere. It was a day out, a break from the relentless grind of peasant life or the monotonous routine of urban craftsmanship. News of an upcoming execution would travel through the grapevine faster than gossip about a scandalous affair. People would flock from miles around, sometimes even taking the day off work, dragging their families along. The town square, usually a bustling hub of commerce, would transform into a grand, if grisly, theater. Vendors would set up stalls, hawking food and drink, roasted meats, fresh bread, perhaps some questionable ale, turning the grim proceedings into a marketplace of both justice and sustenance. It was a bit like a modern-day sporting event, but instead of cheering for touchdowns, the crowd was there to witness a very final, very dramatic touchdown on the field of earthly existence. The procession itself was often a key part of the spectacle. The condemned, sometimes forced to wear a humiliating garment or carry a symbolic object representing their crime, would be paraded through the streets, often accompanied by guards, priests, and the ever-present executioner. This wasn't just a walk. It was a performance designed to maximize public exposure and reinforce the narrative of justice. The route might be lined with onlookers, some silent and somber, others shouting insults, or even occasionally offering a word of comfort or a prayer. It was a chance for the condemned to make a final public statement, to confess sins, to proclaim innocence, or simply to show bravery in the face of death. This journey to the scaffold was the grim overture, building tension before the main act. And the scaffold itself, it wasn't just a simple platform. It was often purposely built high, allowing everyone in the square a clear view, ensuring that no one missed a single detail of the morbid ballet about to unfold. Sometimes it was draped in black cloth, adding to the somber gravitas. The sheer elevation of the platform served a dual purpose. It made the spectacle visible to the maximum number of onlookers, and it physically elevated the concept of justice above the common populace. It was the ultimate stage, where life and death played out for a captive audience. The actual execution was steeped in ritual and symbolism, designed not just to kill, but to teach. The reading of the sentence, often a lengthy pronouncement detailing the crime and the justness of the punishment, was a sermon without a pulpit. It reinforced the authority of the law, the wrath of God, and the dire consequences of disobedience. The last words of the condemned, whether defiant or repentant, were eagerly absorbed by the crowd, sometimes whispered about for weeks afterward. Then came the moment of truth. The executioner, often unmasked for this public display, would perform his duty with a chilling efficiency. The swift fall of the axe, the sudden jerk of the rope, these were not merely physical acts but symbolic pronouncements. They were meant to be clear, unambiguous declarations of the state's power, a final, definitive statement that crimes against the established order would not go unpunished. The very public nature of these events served multiple purposes beyond simply ending a life. First and foremost, it was a powerful deterrent. Imagine seeing someone you knew, or perhaps just someone from your village, suffer such a fate. It burned a lesson into the collective memory far more effectively than any written law could. It was a visceral, unforgettable warning: obey the rules or this could be you. The fear of public shame, public pain, and public death was a potent tool for maintaining social order in a time before widespread literacy or pervasive policing. It was the medieval equivalent of a very dramatic public service announcement, delivered with maximum impact. Secondly, executions served as a powerful demonstration of authority. In a world where central governments were often weak and local lords held immense power, public executions were a chance for the ruling elite to literally display their might. The lord, the mayor, the judge, they were the ones who commanded this ultimate power over life and death. The scaffold became their pulpit, the executioner their instrument, and the condemned their object lesson. It reminded everyone who was in charge and that challenging that authority would lead to catastrophic consequences. It reinforced the social hierarchy, a grim spectacle of power dynamics played out in flesh and blood. Thirdly, and perhaps most disturbingly from a modern perspective, there was the element of entertainment. For many, these events were a thrilling diversion from the drudgery of daily life. The morbid curiosity, the spectacle of human drama, the release of tension, it all contributed to a carnival-like atmosphere. The crowd wasn't always solemn. There could be cheering, jeering, and even bets placed on the swiftness of the execution. It was a macabre form of theater, where the stakes were as high as they could possibly be, and the plot twist was always death. This isn't to say that everyone reveled in it. Many undoubtedly found it horrifying. But for a populace with limited forms of public entertainment, the scaffold offered a raw, unvarnished drama that few other events could match. Finally, public executions also served as a form of communal catharsis and a reaffirmation of societal values. When a particularly heinous crime was committed, a brutal murder, a shocking betrayal, the public execution provided an outlet for collective outrage and a sense that justice had been served. It was a ritual through which the community symbolically purged itself of evil, restoring balance and order. The shared experience, the collective gasp, the common understanding of right and wrong, all solidified the moral fabric of the society. It was a communal exorcism performed on the public stage, ensuring that everyone understood the boundaries and the consequences of transgressing them. So while the executioner himself might have been an ostracized figure, his most famous act, the public execution, was anything but isolated. It was deeply woven into the social, political, and cultural fabric of medieval life, a powerful, multifaceted tool for maintaining order, demonstrating power, and providing a grim form of entertainment and communal cohesion. It was a brutal reminder that in the Middle Ages, justice was often delivered with an audience, a flourish, and a final, definitive cut. It was a brutal reminder that in the Middle Ages, justice was often delivered with an audience, a flourish, and a final, definitive cut. But while the spectacle of an execution might draw crowds and reinforce the hierarchy, there was a less theatrical, more pervasive aspect of medieval urban life that constantly challenged everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the loftiest lord: sanitation. If you thought medieval justice was messy, just wait until you got a whiff of a medieval city on a hot summer day. It was a sensory assault, a symphony of stinks, and a testament to the remarkable human capacity for living in conditions that would send us scrambling for a hazmat suit today. Imagine stepping into a bustling medieval town. Your first impression wouldn't be of charming cobblestones and picturesque cottages, but likely a powerful, almost physical assault on your nostrils. The air hung heavy with a complex bouquet, the sharp tang of human and animal waste, the greasy scent of open drains, the acrid smoke from countless cooking fires, the metallic tang of unwashed bodies, and the cloying sweetness of decaying food. It was a smell that clung to everything, a constant companion that seeped into clothes, hair, and even your very soul. This wasn't just an unpleasant odor. It was a constant, tangible reminder of the pervasive lack of organized waste disposal, a problem that plagued every medieval settlement worthy of the name. The streets themselves were not just pathways, they were quite literally open sewers. Forget the idea of quaint gutters neatly channeling rainwater. In many towns, human and animal excrement, kitchen slop, discarded food scraps, and general household refuse were simply thrown into the narrow lanes. There were no municipal garbage trucks, no complex drainage systems, no city-wide sanitation departments. People would empty their chamber pots directly out of upper-story windows with a perfunctory cry of Gardez-vous, a warning for anyone below to duck for cover, though often too late. This created a perpetually moist, slick, and utterly foul layer of filth underfoot, a prime breeding ground for disease and a constant navigational challenge. Walking down the street was less a stroll and more an obstacle course through a biohazard. Public privies or latrines were rare in early medieval times, and even when they existed, they were often poorly maintained. Most people simply used buckets or went wherever they could find a private spot, which in densely packed urban areas was often nowhere. The sheer volume of human waste generated by even a small town was staggering, and without a systematic way to deal with it, it accumulated rapidly. The ground underneath houses and in courtyards became saturated, turning every corner into a potential health hazard. It was a silent, invisible enemy that infiltrated every aspect of daily life, lurking in the very ground people walked and lived on. And then there were the animals. Pigs, dogs, chickens, they weren't just farm animals kept outside city walls. They were often integral, if unintended, components of the medieval urban sanitation system. Pigs, with their remarkable appetites, were particularly adept at rooting through the street refuse, consuming organic waste that would otherwise rot and attract even more pests. They were the medieval equivalent of tiny, very noisy, and utterly unsanitary garbage disposals, turning the street's culinary discards into more pig. Dogs also played their part, scavenging scraps and keeping rodent populations somewhat in check. But while these animals did offer a crude form of waste removal, they also contributed their own fair share of excrement, adding to the delightful tapestry of urban grime. It was a vicious cycle of waste and consumption, a self-perpetuating ecosystem of filth. The consequences of this pervasive lack of sanitation were predictably dire. Disease was rampant. The close proximity of people, animals, and their waste created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of epidemics. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and countless other bacterial and parasitic infections were constant threats. The Black Death, that infamous grim reaper of the 14th century, found fertile ground in these unsanitary conditions, scything through populations with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't just the big, dramatic plagues. It was the constant, low-level grind of illness, the sniffles that turned into pneumonia, the stomachache that spiraled into a deadly fever. Life expectancy was, for good reason, often astonishingly low. People, of course, weren't entirely oblivious to the problem, but their understanding of disease causation was fundamentally different from ours. They didn't grasp the concept of germs. Instead, they often attributed illness to bad air or miasma, believing that foul smells themselves were the direct cause of sickness. This led to some interesting, if ultimately ineffective, attempts at mitigation. Burning aromatic herbs, sprinkling streets with rosewater, a truly Sisyphean task, or simply holding perfumed cloths to one's nose were common, though purely cosmetic, attempts to ward off the perceived evils of bad air. It was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. Despite the prevailing ignorance about microbiology, some rudimentary efforts were made to manage waste, driven more by aesthetic discomfort and the desire for social order than scientific understanding. Some larger towns or monasteries might have constructed simple drainage channels or conduits, though these often simply diverted the waste from one area to another, rather than truly disposing of it. Cesspits were common, deep holes dug to collect human waste from individual houses, but these required periodic emptying, a task often performed by the lowest members of society, including, as we've discussed, the executioner. Imagine being the unfortunate soul whose job it was to brave the depths of a medieval cesspit, scooping out its vile contents under the cover of night. It was truly a job for the stout of heart and the empty of nose. Marketplaces, the vibrant hearts of medieval towns, were ironically often the worst offenders when it came to sanitation. The constant flow of people, animals, and goods meant an equally constant flow of refuse. Discarded food, animal droppings, and general litter would accumulate rapidly. Regulations might exist, forbidding the dumping of certain types of waste, but enforcement was often lax, and the sheer volume of activity overwhelmed any attempts at cleanliness. Butcher stalls in particular were notorious, with blood and offal often pooling directly onto the ground, attracting swarms of flies and creating a truly gruesome spectacle for shoppers. It was a place where commerce thrived amidst chaos and pervasive filth, a vivid illustration of the medieval tolerance for, and perhaps acceptance of, unhygienic living. So while the public execution was a moment of peak drama, the everyday reality of medieval urban sanitation was a quieter but far more pervasive nightmare. It was a constant battle against filth, disease, and an overwhelming stench, a battle that society often lost. It shaped daily life, influenced health, and served as an undeniable backdrop to every aspect of medieval existence. A pungent reminder that even the most bustling and vibrant city could be, at its heart, a remarkably stinky business. So while the public execution was a moment of peak drama, the everyday reality of medieval urban sanitation was a quieter but far more pervasive nightmare. It was a constant battle against filth, disease, and an overwhelming stench, a battle that society often lost. It shaped daily life, influenced health, and served as an undeniable backdrop to every aspect of medieval existence, a pungent reminder that even the most bustling and vibrant city could be, at its heart, a remarkably stinky business. Given this rather fragrant backdrop, you might be tempted to imagine medieval people as universally grimy, never touching water, and smelling like a forgotten cheese left out in the sun. But hold your horses, or rather your soap. The truth about medieval hygiene. while certainly different from our modern obsession with daily showers and antibacterial everything, is far more nuanced and, dare I say, sometimes surprisingly sophisticated. Let's bust a common myth right off the bat. Medieval people did bathe. They weren't allergic to water, nor did they believe that dirt was a protective layer. The idea that everyone in the Middle Ages was perpetually caked in grime is largely a Victorian-era invention designed to make their own time seem more enlightened. In reality, bathing was a recognized practice, though perhaps not as frequent or as private as our current routines. Public bathhouses were a common feature in many towns, especially during the early and high Middle Ages. These weren't just for getting clean, they were social hubs, places to relax, gossip, and even conduct business. Imagine a medieval spa day complete with steam, communal tubs, and perhaps a bit of light entertainment. It was a place where you could soak away the day's grime and perhaps some of its worries. However, the popularity of public bathhouses waxed and waned. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly after the devastating plagues like the Black Death, their use declined in some areas. The communal nature of the baths, ironically, made them suspect. People, not understanding the true cause of disease, began to associate these public gatherings with the spread of illness. Why risk catching the plague from your neighbor's bathwater when you could just stay home and smell faintly of last week's stew? So while bathing didn't disappear, it often became a more private affair, done at home in wooden tubs if one had the means and access to enough heated water. For the vast majority of the population, a full-body bath might have been an occasional luxury, perhaps once a week, or even less frequently, depending on the season and available resources. But not bathing daily doesn't equate to never cleaning. Medieval people had other tricks up their sleeves. For daily freshening up, a basin of water, a cloth, and perhaps some scented herbs or rosewater were common. Hands and faces would be washed regularly, especially before meals. Think of it as a quick wipe down rather than a full immersion. It was about managing the grime, not eradicating it entirely. And while soap as we know it wasn't universally available or as refined, various forms of lye-based soaps or natural detergents made from plant ashes and animal fats were used, particularly for laundry. Speaking of laundry, clothing played a crucial role in medieval hygiene. Layers were key. People wore inner garments, often made of linen, directly against the skin. These could be washed more frequently than outer garments, acting as a barrier against the dirt and sweat of the body. Imagine your medieval ancestors as masters of the inner layer defense system. The outer garments, made of wool or heavier fabrics, were harder to clean and were therefore washed less often. Instead, they might be aired out, beaten to remove dust, or brushed. It was a practical approach. Protect the expensive outer layers by letting the cheaper, more easily washable inner layers take the brunt of the daily grime. And then there was the eternal battle against lice and fleas. These tiny, unwelcome companions were a fact of life for almost everyone, regardless of social standing. They were the original uninvited house guests, clinging to hair, clothing, and bedding. Medieval people weren't ignorant of their presence, they actively tried to combat them. Fine-toothed combs were used to remove lice from hair. Clothes might be boiled or aired out in the sun, which was believed to kill the pests. Some people even used herbal remedies or wore specific plants in their hair or clothing to deter the little critters. It was a constant, itchy war, fought on a microscopic battlefield, and victory was often fleeting. Dental hygiene was, shall we say, a mixed bag. Tooth decay was certainly prevalent, but medieval people did attempt to clean their teeth. Chewing on rough cloths, using twigs as primitive toothbrushes, or rubbing abrasive powders made from herbs or even ground bones were common practices. Breath fresheners, often in the form of chewing aromatic herbs like mint or parsley, were also employed. It wasn't the sparkling white smiles we see in toothpaste commercials, but it was an effort nonetheless. Hair care varied. Women often kept their hair long and covered, especially married women, as a sign of modesty. Men's hairstyles changed with fashion, but both sexes would wash their hair, though perhaps not with the frequency we'd expect. Herbal rinses and oils were used to clean and condition. Beards were popular for men in many periods, and these too required some level of maintenance to keep them from becoming a haven for crumbs and other unspeakable things. Ultimately, medieval hygiene was a practical, often communal, and somewhat less frequent affair than our modern routines. It was driven by necessity, by a desire for comfort, and by a rudimentary understanding of cleanliness, even if the underlying science of germs remained a mystery. They didn't have hot running water on demand or mass-produced soap or the germ theory of disease, but they were far from the perpetually filthy caricatures we sometimes imagine. They did their best with the tools and knowledge available, navigating a world that was inherently dirtier and more disease-ridden than our own. So next time you step into your gleaming, tiled bathroom, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, who likely considered a warm basin of water and a clean linen shirt a truly luxurious experience, a small victory in the constant, fragrant battle against the pervasive grime of their world. So next time you step into your gleaming, tiled bathroom, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, who likely considered a warm basin of water and a clean linen shirt a truly luxurious experience, a small victory in the constant, fragrant battle against the pervasive grime of their world. But once they'd tackled the monumental task of personal freshness, their thoughts, like ours, would inevitably turn to sustenance. And here, the medieval diet, while perhaps lacking the exotic spice rack of modern cuisine or the endless aisles of a supermarket, offers another fascinating glimpse into daily life, revealing a world where survival often dictated the menu, and innovation sprang from necessity. Forget kale smoothies and quinoa bowls. The undisputed king of the medieval dinner table for virtually everyone was bread. It wasn't just a food, it was the foundation of life, the caloric bedrock upon which everything else was built. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, their days revolved around grain. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, these cereals were ground into flour, and that flour became bread. It was often a dark, dense, incredibly coarse loaf, sometimes mixed with bran or even sawdust by less scrupulous millers that would give your jaw a serious workout. This wasn't the fluffy white wonder bread we know today. This was honest, hearty, fiber-rich stuff that could practically stand on its own. Imagine trying to make a delicate sandwich with it. You'd probably need a chainsaw. It was eaten with every meal, a constant presence, soaking up meager sauces and providing essential energy for grueling manual labor. Next in line, the unsung hero of medieval nutrition was pottage. If bread was the king, pottage was the queen, ruling the daily culinary landscape with humble authority. This was a thick, savory stew, a bubbling cauldron of whatever happened to be on hand. It was the original everything but the kitchen sink meal. Grains like oats, barley, or peas would form the base, cooked slowly in water or broth. To this, you'd add whatever vegetables were available: onions, cabbage, leeks, root vegetables like turnips or parsnips. A bit of cured meat or fish might make an appearance if you were lucky, or if it was a feast day. Pottage was simmered all day, often over an open fire, constantly replenished, making it a truly living dish. It was warm, filling, and adaptable, changing with the seasons and the meager contents of the larder. It was the ultimate comfort food for a hard life, a sort of medieval casserole that never quite ended. And to wash it all down, not water usually. Given the questionable state of medieval sanitation, drinking untreated water was a bit like playing Russian roulette with your intestines. So the beverage of choice for young and old, rich and poor, was ale. It was brewed from grain, relatively weak compared to modern beers, and safer to drink than water because the brewing process killed off most of the harmful bacteria. Children drank it, adults drank it, probably even the family dog got a sip now and then. It was a form of liquid bread, providing both hydration and calories. Wine was also consumed, but it was generally reserved for the wealthier classes or for specific regions where grapes were cultivated. For the common person, ale was the ubiquitous, trusty companion to every meal from dawn till dusk. The seasonal nature of food was a dominant force in medieval life, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the soil. There were no refrigerated trucks bringing fresh produce from across the continent in January. If it wasn't growing locally, you weren't eating it fresh. Summer brought fresh fruits and vegetables, a welcome burst of flavor and vitamins. But once autumn gave way to winter, the menu shrank dramatically. People relied heavily on preserved foods, dried grains, salted meats and fish, root vegetables stored in cool cellars, and cheeses. It was a diet of survival designed to stretch meager resources through the lean months. Imagine eating pickled cabbage and dried fish for weeks on end. It certainly built character, if not culinary excitement. The contrast between the diets of peasants and the wealthy was stark, a vivid reflection of the rigid social hierarchy. For the peasants, life was dominated by the aforementioned grains and vegetables. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a bit of bacon or a tough chicken on a special occasion, or if they were lucky enough to hunt small game often illegally. Their diet was grain-heavy, providing the necessary carbohydrates for their physically demanding lives, but often lacking in protein and variety. They lived on the edge of subsistence, their meals a constant negotiation with nature and the demands of their lords. The wealthy, on the other hand, lived a life of relative culinary indulgence. Their tables groaned under the weight of meat, beef, pork, venison, fowl of all kinds. They had access to fresh game from their private forests, and their livestock was plentiful. Meat was a status symbol, a declaration of wealth and power. They also enjoyed a greater variety of fresh produce, even out of season, thanks to their ability to trade and preserve more effectively. But perhaps the most defining characteristic of noble cuisine was the extravagant use of spices. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, these were incredibly expensive imports brought from distant lands, and their lavish use was a clear display of wealth. Spices weren't just for flavor, they were a way to show off, a culinary equivalent of wearing a diamond necklace. A dish heavily spiced with exotic ingredients screamed, "I am rich," far louder than any spoken word. Beyond the daily staples, there were also fast days dictated by the church. Fridays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, along with the entire season of Lent, were often fast days, meaning no meat or animal products. On these days, fish, often salted or dried, became the primary source of protein. This adherence to religious dietary laws further shaped the medieval palate, adding another layer of constraint and variety to the weekly menu. It meant a constant rotation of meals, shifting from hearty meat dishes to more ascetic fish and vegetable fare, a culinary calendar dictated by spiritual observance. Desserts, as we know them, were rare for the common folk, mostly limited to fresh fruit in season or honey-sweetened pastries for the wealthy. Sugar was an incredibly expensive commodity, a true luxury. For the peasant, a sweet treat might be a handful of berries picked from the hedgerow, or perhaps a honey cake if they were fortunate enough to keep bees. Meals were generally communal affairs, eaten from trenchers, stale bread slices that served as plates and were often eaten afterward or given to the poor, or wooden bowls, with fingers being the primary utensils. Cutlery, as we know it, was largely a later invention, and forks were viewed with suspicion as an effeminate Italian affectation. Eating was a hands-on, robust experience. So while the medieval diet might seem monotonous by today's standards, it was a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability. It was a diet dictated by necessity, by climate, by social status, and by faith. It fueled an entire civilization, allowing people to build cathedrals, fight wars, and endure the daily grind, all on a steady supply of bread, pottage, and ale. It was a culinary world far removed from our own, but one that sustained millions, proving that sometimes the simplest foods are the most powerful. It was a culinary world far removed from our own, but one that sustained millions, proving that sometimes the simplest foods are the most powerful. And as medieval stomachs grumbled with bread and pottage, the ears of the townsfolk were equally engaged, tuned into a soundscape utterly alien to our modern, often quieter existence. If you closed your eyes in a medieval town, you wouldn't just smell it, you'd hear it, a constant, swirling cacophony that acted as the heartbeat and the clock of daily life. The dominant sound, the one that truly defined the rhythm of a medieval town, was the ubiquitous church bell. It was the medieval alarm clock, the town crier, and the spiritual anchor all rolled into one sonorous symphony. Bells rang for matins at dawn, for lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. They marked the hours, signaling work breaks, meal times, and the end of the workday. Imagine living in a world where your entire schedule was dictated by the pealing of massive bells, a giant metallic voice echoing across rooftops and fields. Beyond the regular prayers, bells also tolled for funerals, pealed joyfully for weddings, clanged urgently to warn of fire or invasion, and rang out to celebrate victories or religious festivals. It was a constant, ever-present soundtrack, an auditory reminder of both the sacred and the mundane, the passing of time and the events of the community. But while the bells provided the overarching structure, the streets themselves hummed with a much more chaotic, yet equally vital soundscape. Street vendors were everywhere, their voices cutting through the general din, each crying out their wares in distinctive, often sing-song calls. "Fresh fish, get your fresh fish," someone might bellow, their voice hoarse from hours of shouting. hot pies for a penny," another would chime, the scent of their goods wafting tantalizingly through the air. There were calls for bread, ale, vegetables, herbs, kindling, cloth, and every imaginable commodity. Each vendor developed their unique cry, a personalized jingle designed to catch the ear and entice customers. It was the original advertising, done purely by lung power, turning every street into a bustling, vocal marketplace. The constant clatter of carts and wagons was another inescapable sound, a testament to the fact that medieval towns were living, breathing hubs of commerce and transport. Wooden wheels, often without iron tires in earlier periods, rumbled over uneven cobblestones or dirt paths. The creak of axles, the jingle of harnesses, the rhythmic clip-clop of horses, or the slow plodding of oxen, these were the sounds of goods being delivered, refuse being removed, and people moving from one part of town to another. Every delivery, every journey was announced by its own percussive rhythm, a constant background beat to urban life. As you moved closer to specific areas, the soundscape would shift. Near the blacksmith's forge, the air would vibrate with the rhythmic hammering of metal, a powerful resonant clang as iron was shaped by fire and force. The hiss of quenching steel, the roar of the bellows, the occasional shower of sparks, it was a symphony of industry, a reminder of the vital role these craftsmen played in providing tools, weapons, and everyday necessities. In the market square, the sheer babel of human voices would reach its peak. Bargaining, shouting, laughing, arguing, gossiping, 1,000 conversations intertwining, creating a vibrant, often overwhelming auditory tapestry. The bleating of sheep, the lowing of cattle, the squawking of chickens being sold, these animal noises added another layer to the general chaos. It was a place where information spread faster than any town crier could manage, where news, rumors, and opinions bounced off stall awnings and mingled with the aroma of spices and fresh produce. Beyond the specific trades, the general hum of daily life was omnipresent. The low murmur of conversations from open doorways, the laughter of children playing in narrow alleys, the occasional bark of a dog or meow of a cat, the splash of water from a public well, the rustle of straw as animals moved in their pens, the creak of wooden shutters opening and closing. There was no escaping the sounds of human and animal activity, a constant backdrop that enveloped everyone. Medieval towns weren't quiet retreats. They were buzzing, vibrant organisms, alive with the sounds of continuous occupation. Even the sounds of entertainment were raw and unamplified. A wandering minstrel might play a lute or a pipe in the town square, his music competing with the general hubbub. Storytellers would gather small crowds, their voices rising and falling with the drama of their tales. The raucous laughter from a tavern, the clinking of tankards, the occasional brawl, these were the less refined but equally common sounds of leisure. It was a world without headphones, without recorded music, where every performance was live, raw, and often fleeting. And then there were the sounds of authority. The shrill blast of a guard's whistle, the marching boots of soldiers, the stern voice of a town official making an announcement from the steps of the guild hall, the mournful cry of the executioner as he paraded a condemned prisoner through the streets, or the final, sickening thud of the axe. These were the sounds that cut through the everyday noise, demanding attention, instilling fear, or conveying important news. They were the auditory manifestations of power, asserting control over the unruly urban soundscape. Perhaps the most striking difference from our world was the absence of mechanical noise. No cars, no trains, no airplanes, no whirring refrigerators or humming computers. The loudest mechanical sounds would have been the grinding of a mill wheel, the creak of a well pulley, or the occasional distant siege engine during wartime. This meant that the natural and human-made sounds of daily life were much more prominent, undiluted by the constant thrum of modern machinery. You could probably hear conversations from further away, distinguish individual footsteps, and certainly hear the subtle changes in the wind. The sounds of medieval town life were not just background noise, they were functional. They told you what time it was, what goods were available, where people were working, and what was happening in the community. They were a constant, immersive sensory experience, painting a vivid picture of a bustling, vibrant, and often overwhelming world. It was a world that spoke to you constantly through the clang of the bell, the cry of the vendor, the thud of the hammer, and the endless murmur of humanity. A truly auditory landscape that shaped the very perception of existence. It was a world that spoke to you constantly through the clang of the bell, the cry of the vendor, the thud of the hammer, and the endless murmur of humanity. A truly auditory landscape that shaped the very perception of existence. And nowhere did this auditory tapestry, this vibrant, chaotic hum of daily life, weave itself more intricately than in the beating heart of every medieval town, the marketplace. This wasn't just a place to buy your weekly turnips. It was the ultimate social media platform, the town's bulletin board, and the nerve center of all commerce. A sprawling, lively hub where goods, gossip, and grievances mingled freely. Imagine the marketplace not as a quiet, orderly row of stalls, but as a living, breathing entity pulsating with energy from dawn till dusk. It was the place where the rural met the urban, where the farmer brought his produce and the craftsman sold his wares. Every town, large or small, had one and often multiple markets throughout the week, each specializing in different goods or attracting different crowds. The main market day was usually a big deal, a destination event that drew people from surrounding villages eager to trade, to buy, or simply to witness the spectacle of it all. It was the original main street, but with a lot more mud and a distinct lack of parking enforcement. The variety of goods sold was astonishing, reflecting the self-sufficient yet interconnected nature of medieval life. You'd find towering stacks of bread fresh from the baker's oven, their yeasty aroma mingling with the general street smells. Farmers would lay out their seasonal produce, cabbages, carrots, onions, apples, berries in season, all looking a bit more rustic than today's supermarket specimens, probably still bearing traces of the soil they came from. Poultry clucked in cages, livestock lowed in designated pens, and fresh fish, if the town was near a river or coast, would be displayed, their scales still glistening. It was a feast for the eyes if you could overlook the flies. But the market wasn't just for food. Craftsmen would proudly display the fruits of their labor. The weaver would offer bolts of wool and linen, perhaps even some dyed cloth in vibrant, if somewhat muted, medieval hues. The potter would have stacks of sturdy, unglazed earthenware bowls and jugs. The blacksmith, fresh from his noisy forge, might bring knives, tools, and ironmongery. There would be leather goods, ropes, baskets, wooden utensils, and perhaps even some simple jewelry or religious trinkets. It was a place where you could outfit your entire household, from your cooking pot to your new pair of shoes, all within a few dozen paces. Each vendor had a designated spot, often passed down through generations, creating a familiar, if bustling, landscape. The market's economic function was, of course, paramount. It was the primary mechanism for exchange and trade. Bartering was common, especially for smaller transactions or between individuals, but coin was increasingly used as the economy grew. Prices weren't fixed like they are in a modern store. They were a matter of negotiation, a dance between buyer and seller. Haggling was not just accepted, it was expected. A good bargain was a point of pride, a small victory in the daily struggle for survival. Imagine the spirited debates, the persuasive arguments, the occasional theatrical sigh of despair as a vendor tried to squeeze a few more pennies out of a reluctant customer. It was capitalism in its rawest form, driven by supply, demand, and a healthy dose of theatrical bluster. But to view the market purely through an economic lens would be to miss half the story. It was just as much a hub of social life. For many, especially those from the countryside, market day was the only time they'd come into town, their one opportunity to connect with a wider world. It was a place for chance encounters, for catching up with distant relatives, for arranging marriages, or for simply seeing new faces. The sheer anonymity of the crowd, a rare commodity in close-knit medieval villages, offered a certain freedom, a chance to observe and be observed without constant scrutiny. And if you wanted to know what was going on, the market was your prime source. It was the medieval news agency, unfiltered and often wildly inaccurate. News of distant battles, pronouncements from the king, local scandals, juicy gossip, it all circulated through the market square, whispered from stall to stall, shouted across crowds, amplified and distorted with each retelling. You'd hear tales of bandits on the road, rumors of new taxes, or speculation about the latest plague outbreak. It was a vibrant, if chaotic, information highway powered by human curiosity and a thirst for novelty. Beyond news and gossip, the market also served as a stage for public announcements. The town crier with his bell and booming voice would often choose the busiest part of the market day to proclaim new laws, upcoming events, or royal decrees. Justice might even be dispensed in the market, with minor offenders being placed in the stocks or pillory right in the midst of the bustling crowd, ensuring maximum public humiliation and a clear deterrent for all to see. It was a constant reminder that even amidst the commerce and chatter, the hand of authority was never far away. The atmosphere itself was a heady mix of sounds, smells, and sights. The cries of the vendors, the chatter of the crowd, the rustle of straw, the clatter of coins, the occasional bray of a donkey or the squeal of a pig. The smells of fresh bread, roasting meat, pungent cheeses, and the ever-present undertones of mud and unwashed humanity. The vibrant colors of dyed cloths, the glint of metalwork, the earthy tones of raw produce. It was an overwhelming sensory experience, a constant assault and delight where every sense was engaged. While the market was a place of opportunity, it also had its darker side. Thieves and pickpockets thrived in the dense crowds, their nimble fingers making quick work of loose purses. Disputes over prices or quality could quickly escalate into loud arguments or even brawls. And the constant flow of people meant an increased risk of disease transmission, turning a bustling market day into a potential superspreader event for whatever medieval ailment was making the rounds. It was a place of both vitality and vulnerability, a microcosm of medieval life itself. In essence, the medieval marketplace was far more than just a retail space. It was the vibrant, beating heart of the community, a place where economic necessity met social interaction, where information flowed, and where the daily drama of medieval life played out in all its gritty, charming, and often chaotic glory. It was a place of livelihood and leisure, a mirror reflecting the intricate tapestry of human connection, all underscored by the never-ending rhythm of trade and chatter. In essence, the medieval marketplace was far more than just a retail space. It was the vibrant, beating heart of the community, a place where economic necessity met social interaction, where information flowed, and where the daily drama of medieval life played out in all its gritty, charming, and often chaotic glory. But while the marketplace dealt in tangible goods and immediate needs, there was another, far more elusive, commodity that everyone yearned for: health. And here, medieval medicine, with its curious blend of ancient wisdom, folk remedies, and outright superstition, offered a fascinating, if often terrifying, glimpse into a world where getting sick was less an inconvenience and more an existential threat. Imagine falling ill in the Middle Ages. There was no urgent care, no ambulance, no Google to diagnose your mysterious rash. Your understanding of the human body and what made it tick was, to put it mildly, a bit theoretical. The prevailing medical wisdom was rooted deeply in humoral theory, an idea inherited from ancient Greek and Roman thinkers. This wasn't just a quaint belief, it was the bedrock of all medical practice, a sort of medieval operating system for the human body. The theory proposed that the body was made up of 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was associated with specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and linked to elements, seasons, and even temperaments. Health, according to this belief, was a delicate balancing act. When these humors were in perfect equilibrium, you were hale and hearty. When they got out of whack, well, that's when the fun began, usually in the form of a fever, a cough, or a general feeling of impending doom. So if you had a fever, it might be because you had too much hot blood. If you were feeling sluggish and melancholic, perhaps an excess of cold, black bile was to blame. The entire aim of medieval medicine, therefore, was to restore this precious balance. And how did they do that? Often with methods that would make a modern doctor faint clean away. One of the most common and perhaps most infamous remedies was bloodletting. If you had too much blood, the obvious solution was to take some outright. Whether it was a fever, a headache, or just a bad mood, the answer was often a good bleed. This could involve cutting a vein, often in the arm or neck, or applying leeches, those squirming, blood-sucking little creatures that were surprisingly popular medical tools. Imagine a medieval doctor, or more likely, a barber surgeon, looking at your pale face and declaring, "Ah, too much blood, my friend, let's get that out." It was a procedure performed with astonishing frequency, often weakening the patient further, but done with the firm conviction that it was restoring balance. It was like trying to fix a leaky faucet by draining the entire water tank. Another popular method for rebalancing the humors was purging or inducing vomiting. If you had an excessive bile, for instance, the solution was to get it out one way or another. Potions made from various herbs or minerals designed to make you violently ill were common. The idea was to literally expel the offending humor from the body, a rather dramatic and unpleasant form of internal spring cleaning. It was a bit like trying to clear a clogged drain by throwing a hand grenade down it. Beyond these rather aggressive physical interventions, medieval medicine was deeply intertwined with religious practices. In a world where God's will was seen as paramount, illness was often interpreted as divine punishment for sins or a test of faith. Prayer was a powerful remedy, often the first line of defense. People would pray to specific saints known for healing certain ailments, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throat issues. Pilgrimages to holy sites, touching relics, or even wearing religious amulets were common practices, blending spiritual belief with the hope of physical recovery. It was a holistic approach, where the soul's health was seen as inextricably linked to the body's. And then there was the truly fascinating, often bizarre realm of superstition and folk beliefs. While educated physicians adhered to humoral theory, the common person often relied on a mix of traditional wisdom, magical thinking, and outright charm. Amulets made from specific stones or animal parts were worn for protection. Astrological charts were consulted to determine the best time for a bloodletting or to predict the course of an illness. Charms, incantations, and rituals were performed to ward off evil spirits or to appease malevolent forces believed to cause disease. If you had a wart, you might rub it with a stolen piece of bacon and bury it under a full moon. If you had a fever, you might sleep with a raw onion under your pillow. It was a world where the line between medicine and magic was incredibly blurry, and every ailment had a dozen potential, often outlandish, cures. The people who actually delivered this medieval healthcare were a diverse bunch. At the top of the hierarchy were the physicians. These were the learned men, often educated at universities, who studied ancient texts by Hippocrates, Galen, and Arabic scholars. They were the theorists, the diagnosticians who would examine urine, pulse, and symptoms, all through the lens of humoral theory. They were expensive, often only accessible to the wealthy elite, and their treatments, while based on the best available knowledge, were often ineffective or even harmful by modern standards. Their tools were primarily their minds, their books, and perhaps a urine flask. But for the vast majority of the population, the real medical work was done by the barber surgeons. These were the practical, hands-on medical professionals, often combining their haircutting trade with minor surgical procedures. Imagine going in for a trim and leaving with a freshly pulled tooth. They were the general practitioners of their day, performing procedures that physicians often disdained as beneath them. They would set broken bones, lance boils and abscesses, pull teeth, often without anesthesia save for a swig of ale or a prayer, and perform rudimentary amputations when gangrene set in. Their knowledge came less from books and more from direct experience, from the raw reality of working with the human body. They were the ones who saw the immediate, often bloody, consequences of accidents and infections. Below them, and often serving the rural poor, were the wise women or local healers. These were often older women with generations of accumulated knowledge about herbs, traditional remedies, and local folk cures. They were the herbalists, the midwives, the ones who knew which plant could soothe a cough or which poultice could draw out infection. They operated outside the formal medical establishment, but were often the most accessible and trusted healers for the common person. Their wisdom passed down through oral tradition rather than university lectures. The limitations of medieval medicine were, of course, immense. The lack of understanding of germs meant that hygiene in medical procedures was virtually non-existent, leading to rampant infections. Anesthesia was rudimentary at best, making any surgical procedure an agonizing ordeal. Pain management was largely limited to alcohol or opium if available. And despite the executioner's practical anatomical knowledge, the broader understanding of internal human anatomy was still developing, often hindered by religious prohibitions against dissection. High mortality rates, especially for children and during childbirth, were a grim reality. So while medieval people certainly tried to heal themselves and each other, their efforts were often a blend of educated guesswork, inherited wisdom, desperate hope, and a healthy dose of superstition. It was a medical landscape where a broken leg might be set by a barber, a fever treated with leeches, and a prayer offered for every cough. It was a world where illness was a constant, terrifying companion, and the path to recovery was often as perilous as the ailment itself, a testament to human resilience in the face of profound medical ignorance. It was a world where illness was a constant, terrifying companion, and the path to recovery was often as perilous as the ailment itself, a testament to human resilience in the face of profound medical ignorance. But for the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, the daily grind wasn't about the drama of the executioner, the smells of the city, or the mysteries of medicine. It was about something far more fundamental, far more pervasive: the land. For the overwhelming majority of the medieval population, life was lived under the open sky, dictated by the seasons and bound by the ancient rhythms of agricultural labor. This was the world of the peasant, a life of relentless toil, deep-rooted family ties, and an unbreakable bond to the soil they worked. Imagine waking before dawn, not to the gentle hum of an alarm clock, but to the crow of a rooster or the first sliver of light painting the eastern sky. For the peasant, every day was a workday, and the work was hard, physical, and unending. Their lives were inextricably linked to the agricultural calendar. Spring meant plowing and sowing, the back-breaking labor of turning heavy earth and scattering precious seeds, hoping for a bountiful harvest. Summer brought weeding, tending crops, and the anxious wait for the ripening. Autumn was the frantic rush of harvest, gathering the fruits of their labor, a period of intense activity that determined whether they would eat well or face hunger in the coming winter. Winter, while offering a slight reprieve from the fields, still involved caring for livestock, repairing tools, and preparing for the next cycle. It was a constant dance with nature, a never-ending cycle of effort and hope, where a single bad harvest could spell disaster. Their tools were simple, often handmade, and incredibly inefficient by modern standards. The wooden plow pulled by oxen or horses slowly turned the earth. Scythes and sickles were used for harvesting, requiring immense skill and stamina. Flails threshed grain, separating the precious kernels from the chaff. Every task, from planting a single seed to grinding flour, was a manual endeavor, powered by human muscle and sheer determination. There were no tractors, no combine harvesters, no automated mills. It was a life lived at the pace of an ox, a testament to the sheer physical endurance of the medieval commoner. The peasant's life was not just about individual effort, it was deeply communal. The family unit was the bedrock of medieval society, a self-sufficient economic engine. Everyone, from the youngest child capable of scaring away birds to the oldest grandparent capable of mending clothes, had a role to play. Children learned by doing, mimicking their parents from a young age, absorbing the skills necessary for survival. Marriage was less about romantic love and more about economic partnership, a way to combine resources and labor. Large families were common, not just for companionship, but for sheer necessity. More hands meant more work done, more mouths to feed, but also more potential for future labor. It was a tight-knit existence, where survival depended on cooperation and mutual support within the household. But while the family was the immediate sphere of influence, the peasant's life was ultimately governed by their relationship with the lord of the manor. This was the essence of the feudal system, a complex web of obligations and dependencies that defined medieval society. The land they worked wasn't truly theirs, it belonged to the lord, who in turn held it from a higher noble, and so on all the way up to the king. In exchange for protection and the right to live and work on the lord's land, the peasant owed a variety of feudal obligations. The most significant of these was labor service. Peasants were required to work on the lord's domain, his personal lands, for a certain number of days each week, often 2 or 3. This meant tilling his fields, harvesting his crops, repairing his fences, or performing any other task the Lord demanded, all before they could even tend to their own meager strips of land. It was a constant drain on their time and energy, a form of unpaid labor that was the very foundation of the Lord's wealth and power. Imagine having a full-time job and then having to work another 20 hours a week for free just to keep your own home. Beyond labor, peasants also owed rent, though this wasn't always paid in coin. Often it was paid in kind, a portion of their harvest, a certain number of chickens, a dozen eggs, or a measure of grain. They might also owe a fee for using the Lord's mill to grind their grain or his oven to bake their bread. These were the economic ties that bound them to the manor, ensuring a steady flow of resources to the Lord's coffers. It was a system designed to extract surplus from the laboring class, ensuring the prosperity of the landed elite. Peasants were also subject to the Lord's justice. Minor disputes, petty crimes, and infractions of manorial custom were handled in the Lord's court, presided over by his bailiff or steward. This meant that the Lord held immense power over their daily lives, from settling arguments over land boundaries to punishing minor thefts. It was a localized form of law and order, often arbitrary and always serving the Lord's interests. Despite the hardships, life on the manor wasn't entirely without its moments of respite or community. Religious festivals, saints' days, and local celebrations offered breaks from labor, opportunities for feasting, dancing, and communal gatherings. The church was the center of village life, providing spiritual guidance, social cohesion, and sometimes even rudimentary education. While their lives were circumscribed by the manor, peasants found ways to build community, celebrate life's milestones, and endure the relentless demands of their existence. The peasant's dwelling was typically a simple one-room cottage, often shared with their livestock for warmth. It was built from local materials, timber frames, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, and furnished sparsely with a few wooden stools, a table, and perhaps a simple bed stuffed with straw. Smoke from the central hearth often filled the room, providing warmth but also contributing to respiratory ailments. It was a humble abode, a shelter from the elements, but also a constant reminder of their place in the social order. Life for the medieval peasant was undeniably harsh, a constant struggle against the elements, disease, and the demands of their lords. It was a world shaped by the rhythm of the seasons, the necessity of manual labor, and the intricate web of feudal obligations. But it was also a life of deep community, resilience, and an enduring connection to the land that sustained them. They were the silent majority, the backbone of medieval society, their tireless efforts literally feeding the castles, the towns, and the very fabric of the age. A testament to the enduring power of human labor and the simple, profound act of coaxing life from the earth. They were the silent majority, the backbone of medieval society, their tireless efforts literally feeding the castles, the towns, and the very fabric of the age, a testament to the enduring power of human labor and the simple, profound act of coaxing life from the earth. And it was within this often harsh, labor-intensive world that medieval childhood unfolded, a period far removed from our modern notions of protected innocence, structured playdates, and endless educational opportunities. In the Middle Ages, childhood was often brief, practical, and a rapid transition into the responsibilities of adulthood. Imagine a medieval baby. From the moment of birth, life was precarious. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, a constant shadow hanging over every family. Many children didn't survive past their first birthday, succumbing to diseases, infections, or simply the harsh conditions of the time. For those who did, their early years were spent largely at home, cared for by mothers, older siblings, or other female relatives. There were no brightly colored plastic toys or elaborate playpens. Instead, infants might play with simple wooden dolls, rag figures, or perhaps a polished stone. Their world was the immediate confines of their home and the watchful eyes of their family. As soon as a child could toddle, their informal education began. This wasn't about sitting at a desk with a slate and chalk. It was about learning by doing, absorbing the skills necessary for survival directly from their parents and older community members. A young boy would follow his father into the fields, learning how to sow seeds, how to handle a hoe, how to care for livestock. He'd watch the blacksmith, mimicking the swing of the hammer, absorbing the rhythm of the forge. A young girl would learn alongside her mother, mastering the arts of spinning wool, weaving cloth, baking bread, tending the kitchen garden, and caring for younger siblings. Every chore was a lesson, every task a step towards competence. There was no formal curriculum, just the daily, relentless instruction of necessity. Play, while present, was often less structured than today. Children played games that mimicked adult activities, mock battles, small-scale farming, or domestic roles. They might chase hoops, play with sticks and stones, or engage in simple games like tag or hide-and-seek. Dolls, toy soldiers, and miniature tools were common, reflecting the world around them. But these moments of pure play often quickly transitioned into real work. A game of chasing chickens could become a lesson in herding. Building a mud hut could turn into helping mend a wall. There was a constant osmosis between amusement and utility. Formal education, as we understand it, was a rare luxury, primarily reserved for the children of the elite or those destined for the church. For the vast majority of peasant children, school was the field, the workshop, or the home. Literacy was uncommon, and numeracy was often limited to basic counting and accounting necessary for trade or managing household resources. A small number might attend a village priest's informal lessons, learning basic prayers or perhaps a few letters, but comprehensive schooling was virtually non-existent for the common child. The transition from childhood to adulthood was remarkably swift. There was no long, drawn-out adolescence, no teenage years as we perceive them today. By the age of 7, a child was often considered capable of contributing meaningfully to the household economy. They might be tasked with chores like fetching water, gathering firewood, tending animals, or helping in the fields. A 10-year-old could be doing the work of a small adult, especially during busy seasons like harvest. By 12 or 14, a young person was often considered ready for apprenticeships or even marriage. Imagine graduating from childhood directly into a full-time job or even a marital contract before you've even had a chance to discover who you are. Apprenticeships were the primary path for children, particularly boys, to learn a trade. A young boy, often around the age of 10 or 12, would be sent to live with a master craftsman, a blacksmith, a baker, a carpenter, a shoemaker for a period of several years. He would work for the master, often without pay beyond his keep, learning the skills of the trade from the ground up. This was a rigorous, often harsh, form of education where discipline was strict and expectations were high. It was a commitment that shaped a young person's entire future, determining their livelihood and social standing. Girls, while less commonly apprenticed to trades outside the home, might enter service in other households to learn domestic skills or even craft-based work like brewing or weaving. For girls, the path to adulthood often led directly to marriage, usually arranged by their parents, sometimes as early as 14 or 15, though often a bit older. The primary purpose of marriage was not romantic love, but the establishment of a new economic unit, the continuation of the family line, and the production of heirs. A young woman would transition from her parents' household to her husband's, immediately taking on the responsibilities of managing a home, raising children, and contributing to the family's labor. It was a swift immersion into the practicalities of adult life, often with little preparation beyond what she had observed and practiced in her childhood home. The concept of youth existed, but it was understood differently. It was a period of transition, often marked by a certain degree of freedom and exuberance, particularly for young men before they settled into marriage and full adult responsibility. But this freedom was relative and usually short-lived, quickly curtailed by the demands of land, family, and feudal obligations. The pressure to contribute, to marry, and to perpetuate the lineage was immense, leaving little room for a prolonged period of self-discovery or carefree abandon. Despite the hardships and the rapid onset of adult responsibilities, medieval children undoubtedly experienced moments of joy, love, and wonder, just like children in any era. There were festivals, religious holidays, family gatherings, and the simple pleasures of communal life. Parents loved their children, mourned their losses, and celebrated their successes, even if their expressions of affection might seem less overt by modern standards. Their lives were filled with the tangible realities of their world. The warmth of a fire, the taste of fresh bread, the comfort of family, the beauty of the changing seasons. So while medieval childhood lacked the structured play and extensive education we associate with it today, it was a practical, hands-on apprenticeship for survival. Children were not just small adults, they were vital contributors to the household economy, rapidly initiated into the demanding rhythms of medieval life. Their early years were a crucible forging resilient, self-sufficient individuals ready to navigate a world that offered few soft landings. A profound journey from infancy to full participation in the relentless, yet often deeply communal tapestry of the medieval age. A profound journey from infancy to full participation in the relentless, yet often deeply communal tapestry of the medieval age. But if the peasant's life was dictated by the land and the family, the urban dweller's existence, while still rooted in community, was often shaped by another powerful force, the guild. These weren't just glorified trade unions. They were the backbone of medieval urban economy and society, acting as everything from quality control police to social clubs, shaping the very fabric of craft, commerce, and daily life in the bustling towns. Imagine a medieval town without guilds and you'd have chaos. Every cobbler would charge what he pleased, every baker could scrimp on ingredients, and every weaver could churn out shoddy cloth. The guild stepped in to prevent this Wild West scenario. They were organizations of craftsmen or merchants, all practicing the same trade, who banded together for mutual protection, regulation, and advancement. If you wanted to be a proper baker, a respectable tailor, or a master goldsmith, you absolutely had to be a part of your respective guild. It was the original good old boys club, but with very strict rules about how much flour went into a loaf of bread. Their primary function was the regulation of trades. This was about maintaining quality and preventing unfair competition. Guilds set strict standards for workmanship. A master weaver, for instance, had to ensure his cloth was of a certain thread count, color, fastness, and durability. If it wasn't up to snuff, the guild masters would come knocking, and there could be serious repercussions, from fines to expulsion. This protected both the reputation of the trade and the consumer, ensuring that when you bought a sword from a guild member blacksmith, it wouldn't bend like a noodle in your first skirmish. It was a rigorous system of peer review, enforced with an iron fist, or perhaps a very firm, guild-approved tap on the shoulder. Beyond quality, guilds controlled prices and wages. They set fair prices for goods and services, preventing unscrupulous members from undercutting others and driving them out of business. They also regulated the wages paid to journeymen and apprentices, ensuring a degree of economic stability for their members. This wasn't about free market capitalism. It was about controlled, ordered commerce, designed to benefit the collective membership rather than just a few ambitious individuals. Imagine trying to open a coffee shop today, and a powerful local association dictates your latte prices and your barista's hourly rates. That was the guild system in action. The guild system also provided a clear and structured path for apprentices to become masters. This was a multi-stage journey that began in childhood. A young boy, typically around the age of 12 or 14, would become an apprentice to a master craftsman. He would live in the master's household, working for free, learning the basics of the trade. This period could last anywhere from 7 to 14